that kind of was my final evolution to realizing like I need to completely lose my concept of treating disease and only focus on how do cells actually receive energy, process energy in that metabolic path, and how are the nutrients available for the optimal health to present itself. So that's been generally my journey there.
Thank you so much. I will guess I introduce myself also briefly, and as I will also try to fill the role a little bit that Felipe left, because Felipe was supposed to join us and would have given really the pharma and the regenerative agribusiness perspective, which I think plays a big part in what we are discussing here. So I'm Simon, I'm from Germany. I have my own genesis from, let's say, FMCG companies in the food industry, and then also really got onto the path of regenerative agriculture, understanding ever more the importance of the soil microbiome, the soil science revolution in soil biology, and went all through the Americas from big farms to indigenous people. And now we founded in Europe the new independent and farmer-led European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, in which we are really trying to bring together the farmers from all farm types, so from very big arable farms to mixed farms and their conservation, agriculture legacy, to regenerative organic, to smallholder conservation agriculture farms. In Europe, we don't have really indigenous people as such anymore, but we understand all those farmers from all the different types who are pioneering their way to acknowledging really soil biodiversity as a most important means of agricultural production, as a way of re-indigenizing ourselves. And maybe this, I would also like to start in the deep roots of the problems you both are now making your professional legacy on. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your perspective and analysis, how maybe settler colonialism started the whole history of what we now are trying to reverse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most effective ways to try and decimate and dominate a people is to dominate their food systems. A huge component of settler colonialism was, of course, forced removal, extermination, genocide, destruction of our family systems, banning us from teaching our languages and our traditions, and essentially just trying to either make us settlers or try to make us dead. That's really all there was to it. As far as how that has impacted our food systems, I mean, one, there's a complete loss of, well, not a complete loss, because there are revivals, which I will get into as well. There is a lot of impetuses to indigenous peoples practicing our traditional food systems. I mentioned that I'm really interested in endocrine disrupting chemicals. For a lot of coastal tribes, there's a huge issue with contaminated fish that are contaminated with organotins, which was originally a molicide used on shipping hubs. So there's kind of two levels of how colonial methods have impacted indigenous peoples there, because it's one, the methods of transport that are emphasizing using molicides to try and, I don't know, make their lives slightly more convenient at the expense of killing, natural creatures. But those organotins are an endocrine disrupting chemical that bioaccumulate in the fish and then are passed on to anyone who eats it, and even in breast milk from parent to child. So that's a pretty deep area of concern for a lot of tribes, and that's even just getting into, trying to practice traditional fishing techniques. When we get into some other components of agriculture and the land, one of the things that I've been doing a lot of thinking about and mentioning kind of all over COP is the settler colonial view of land and how that has shaped our food systems. So a settler colonial view of land views the land and nature and our natural environment in two ways that are exceptionally problematic. It's viewed as simplistic, and it's viewed as subservient. The settler view of land is heavily interlinked with the settler view of women and femininity. Nature is feminized, but more more of an issue than it being feminized. It's feminized with settler ideas of femininity that emphasize subservience, being at your service, and being able to be dominated. There's a reason that we're facing climate collapse at the same time we're having an epidemic of missing and murdered women, girls, and two-spirits. So this relationship with the land and seeing the land as something that can be dominated rather than something you work with has really set the floor for our current agricultural system. That's why we're focused on using pesticides. That's why we're focused on overproduction. That's why we don't care about the farm workers who are slaving away in the fields with minimal to no protections, and that are only there anyways because of settler constructs, settler borders, more modern day colonial and imperial initiatives that have disrupted multiple quote-unquote Central and South American countries, causing forced migration, settler colonialism in the Philippines. It's all heavily interlinked, both in terms of how the land has been set up down to the current conditions that are causing people to be in desperate situations where they have to, do farm work with extremely minimal protections for pennies a day, and not practice traditional modes of agriculture or any kind of practices with the land. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's often completely forgotten now also, for example, the Industrial Revolution in Europe and all the protein that was necessary for the people firstly working in the land after the commons were enclosed, really was fed on exploiting the rich fisheries of the east coast of the US. So already in 1730, we had over 400 relatively big industrial, though wooden boats going every summer over the Atlantic to go there and exploit the fisheries of the indigenous Americans there. And also, maybe to put it further, I think we can also say this segregation of land use and segregation of people co-evolves in a sense. And we had the first invention of, or the use of the first pesticide of Schweinsfoot green or Paris green also in the US after we firstly used potatoes and grew potatoes in such a large scale, in such a segregated way. Of course, we also only found the potatoes after we colonized the Americas in the south. And maybe you could take us into how this evolution of the use of pesticides and the segregation of land use is driving some of the most problematic diseases and costly diseases we have today.
Yeah, it's so interesting to put those two histories in parallel. I think if you're looking at what is the relationship between colonialism and disease, they're actually the same thing. Colonialism is the original communicable disease of humans. It's a very infectious process or infectious philosophy, colonialism. So much so that if you spend time down in the Amazon right now, I spent time with the Achuar tribe, which was the very last indigenous peoples to make contact with the industrial complex of the world today as we know it. In 1996 was first contact. So they are first generation contact, still alive there. And in spending time with the tribe, you can sit with a shaman who's practicing traditional wisdom and practices that's been emergent over a 40,000-year history, and sitting behind him is his children in their 30s and grandchildren all scrolling Facebook on their phones. And so it's frightening how fast we get to this point of inducing the human mind into the drug state that I would call colonialism. It's a very communicable philosophy, a communicable disease, and it is a dis-ease of belief that we don't have enough. And it's that fear of not having enough, that scarcity mentality that seems so infectious in the human mind. I think we're very vulnerable to the belief that we're not enough, therefore we don't have enough, that we're not taken care of by nature, that we've been kicked out of nature. Somehow that's a philosophy that can break in a single generation 40,000 years of trust with that same nature. The Achuar tribe does not have any food storage in their traditional homes because they knew that they could walk out every day into that food forest that they had created called the Amazon, and it would provide for them day in and day out. And so there was no reason to store anything because they would be provided for enough tomorrow. And in a single generation, they sit around after traditional ceremony telling Westerners who are visiting that they need money so they can buy gasoline for the new motors that are on their canoes that they've been paddling for 40,000 years up and down the Amazon River. And so there's this insidious way in which technology that creates convenience plays into this scarcity mentality of the human mind that creates this kind of disease slip. So what happened in North America is pretty profound. We had a now estimated 100 million peoples in North America, Canada, United States, Mexico, at the time that the Europeans landed. 100 million people that had been in a really balanced relationship not only to their agricultural system, which was far more advanced than the European model. There was much more complex science and agricultural practices throughout the Americas that was intact. And if you read any of the original documents of some of the Europeans that were there for the first couple hundred years, they were all learning from the Iroquois nation how to farm traditional foods. And as they moved west, many other nations taught them their indigenous practices. And so there was this huge advancements. But if you contrast 100 million people living in complete food sovereignty and balance with their ecosystem for tens of thousands of years in North America versus Europe at the time, which was dying of starvation. That's why my relatives came to North America 400 years ago from Ireland, was because they were starving. And so Europe had collapsed its food system out of that failure to understand relationship to land. And so this is something that now continues to play out. Now that we've extracted all the resources out of the soils of North America, we're now going further and further abroad to extract those nutrients from somebody else's soil. And so currently, to buy food in Los Angeles, your supply chain is typically 3,000 kilometers to your nearest food. And that's the best case scenario, really, because all of the produce that's grown in the United States is grown in California. And so if you're in Midwest, you're in a complete food desert in the middle of the United States. So much so that you might have to drive a couple hours to the nearest grocery store. And our whole Midwest, from Michigan all the way down to the Mexico Gulf, has become a ghost town. We've boarded up retail. All of our shops are closed. You have to drive for a couple hours to find a big box Walmart or Costco or these big distribution centers that are selling you food that was grown tens of thousands of kilometers away. And so that's the creep of this belief that there's not enough. We extract and extract and extract until there's nothing left. And then we go look for a new planet, which is what all our billionaires are now busy doing, is finding us a new planet to extract from. So sadly, we play this thing out on a very grand cosmic scale of the fear that we're separate from nature.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so much to unpack or go on from there. I think also then maybe let's try to focus a little bit how we can regrow our planet instead of hoping for extracting another planet. I think another interesting insight also for our Western supremacy is that actually the European Enlightenment was kind of influenced by Candiarok, an indigenous North American that the Jesuits found and then brought to the US, so to Europe. So for example, Rousseau and all the social contract we built our modern nation state on is, in a sense, the grown of the idea of freedom was inoculated by the indigenous people. And we have now, as you already mentioned, also great indigenous science also in the US coming up describing the abundance of the old food systems, so that they actually had a higher yield per hectare while producing massively more positive ecosystem services instead of exploiting. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more. You told us already about maybe the kelp forests, the fisheries, but also on land, what kind of practices and systems the indigenous people built and grew to foster this abundance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. So obviously it varies a lot place by place, and especially whether or not you're more of a nomadic tribe or if you're more agrarian. So I'm Chiricahua Apache. Our people are actually traditionally nomadic throughout the Southwest in what is now considered Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Colorado. But as far as some agrarian systems go, there's obviously the famous three-sister method, where you have beans to fix nitrogen, you have corn to produce a nice stable sort of trellis, and you have squash as a nitrogen receiver, and also to have larger leaves for moisture trapping with to catch all that nice evapotranspiration that plants will give off. So there's that for agrarian methods. I think that there's also a lot to be said in terms of being nomadic and learning to live with the land instead of constantly trying to force one particular parcel to produce for you. It's moving on with respect with nature and hunting and gathering elsewhere. There's also a lot of kind of traditional respect for animals and plant life that is just not seen these days. We view these other species as kin, not as something that we are able to dominate over, which is something that inherently leads to more moderation. I'm thinking currently some traditional practices that are either under threat or undergoing revival are happening in the Pacific Northwest. So I've done a tiny bit of food sovereignty work with the Klamath tribes up in Southern Oregon. And one of the focus groups that I was really honored to be a part of was talking about how APAWs, which are kind of a carrot-like root vegetable, are scarce now, in part because of changing climate and then also land encroachment, overdevelopment, that kind of thing, that is impacting the ability of people to pass on traditional teachings. Same thing with bear grass. A huge part of agriculture for indigenous peoples is also our systems of land management. Obviously, tribes in what is now considered Northern California, Southern Oregon, Washington, the Pacific Northwest areas have advanced forms of fire management. And that's necessary because there's a lot of species that need fire in order for their seeds to release. Like, that's how redwoods end up kind of repopulating. So there's this idea of sort of the noble savage that is still perpetuated in an idea of living in not even so much harmony with the land, but living in the land in a simplistic manner, which could not be further from the truth. So I think it's important to mention the forms of land management that allowed for agriculture and systems of plant identification that would allow for a more nomadic lifestyle for tribes for whom that was a better call. One of the other really cool areas of food revival is actually happening in Kansas and Nebraska. So I do some work with the Mayan Economic Development Corporation, and yes, the Mayan government does have basically the equivalent of an embassy in Omaha, Nebraska, because during the 80s, there was migration from Honduras and Guatemala to flee, political violence. And a lot of Mayans ended up settling in the Midwest because the meatpacking industry was booming at that time. And so they've kind of settled and made a home. There is a mutual ambassadorship between the Omaha tribe and the Canjabal Maya Nation. So that's honestly really cool. There's also a lot of collaborative work with the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, who are working. They've actually developed a free economic zone, which is incredible because that means that they can kind of beat the US at trade and don't have to deal with all the tariffs and taxes kind of system. But they're also regrowing organic oats and corn in those areas. So there's a huge level of traditional practices being revived. And one of the things that's also really interesting is how it is scalable and is getting some more commercial interest. Oatly is actually interested, Oatly is actually interested in that type of collaboration. So when we think of traditional indigenous agriculture, we might not necessarily think of it being at scale, and we might not necessarily think about intertribal cooperation or even the political and economic systems that allow for that revival, but it plays a huge role in whether or not it's going to be successful. So again, it gets back into land management and sovereignty over our lands to be able to do this.
Yes, thank you so much. I think you sketched it wonderfully, and then maybe I'm allowed just to point out there's a beautiful new PhD thesis by Lila Johnson, an indigenous.
Oh yeah, she was at the Indigenous People Summit I organized. I invited her.
Wonderful, yes, and it's a beautiful, beautiful scientific study on the highly complex and sophisticated integration of land use of the indigenous people and the abundance of food that was created there. And I think today with regenerative agriculture, I mean true Antigua in regenerative agriculture, we're going there again. So with syntropic alley cropping, with grazing management, and all the diversity of seeds and plants. And maybe then we can try to make the arc to really how bad is a big egg and where this is coming from, because I think we can connect the keywords are somehow abundance and scarcity, as you also mapped it out then, and maybe I'm allowed to just once go back as far as we can. I don't know if you know Abdullah Öcalan, an indigenous Kurdish scientist and activist who's bringing this whole lineage of kind of patriarchy, gerontocracy, and capitalist extraction all the way back to the Sumerians, which are kind of in this area where we are today, and connects this settler colonialist philosophy basically to grain-based agriculture. So here where we are today, the Arabian Peninsula and the Sahara, 5,000 to 10,000 years ago were green, lavish ecosystems. And we degraded them. The whole Iraq region was actually wetlands. And today, last year, the wheat yields of Iraq imploded from one year on the other by 90%. So that's a radical break, which is making an end to grain-based agriculture in Iraq for now and probably forever in our lifetimes. And we really see this segregation, which was already degrading ecosystems long before we had pesticides. And now today, how bad is big agriculture? I think we can start, if we jump forward then to the Green Revolution, which was kind of also fed by this great fear of scarcity. We're coming out of the First and Second World War. We had the experience of famine in Europe, and then we went into producing a lot of grains, and then we ran into the problem of having too many grains, too much supply, too little demand. Prices were breaking down, and farmers needed to be subsidized to stay alive, and we kind of invented grain-based big livestock. And maybe you could take us from there, how this is starting to grow, what we now have, zoonosis, etc., and non-communicable diseases.
Yeah, I think I would like to just put a really fine point on this, is that we would not have a reason for COP to exist if not for chemical agriculture. We would not have a sixth extinction unfolding if not for chemical agriculture. There is no bigger problem on this planet today than our relationship to soil. It's absolutely ground zero of our collapse of relationship to planet. There is no other industry on Earth that has done as much damage or puts as much threat on the human species and our continued existence than our relationship to chemical agriculture. There has been so much focus on the energy sector as if it's the problem. I'm not saying it doesn't do damage. We certainly do damage with every human industry we've ever created, with the exception of art, which we should probably think about a little bit at some point, is that the only thing that we do that does no harm is our art. And so we need to probably start rethinking our cultures and societies into a place where we really focus on doing only art. And our art might be co-creating in the backyard garden, but we need to have a creative relationship to this earth rather than an extractive relationship. And there is no greater extraction than we do than the agricultural system. chemical agriculture, as you mentioned, with the Green Revolution, was the accelerant. It was the gasoline on a fire that was smoldering for thousands of years before that. And so, like you said, right here in the Middle East, we had these verdant grasslands, which were the biggest in the world. North Africa was not the Sahara Desert even 1,000 years ago. With the Roman Empire, they were growing all of the grains for Europe in North Africa. Those river systems collapsed under those agricultural extractions that were being done by that colonial force of the Roman Empire. And so we have a very clear history that agriculture sits at this ground zero of a failing biology of the planet. And I want to emphasize again and again that we do not have a climate change crisis. We have a biologic collapse. Calling it climate change is missing the point so radically that we are not solving the problem, because we think that the problem is a gas, CO2, in the atmosphere that is critical for life to occur. CO2 is literally our path forward. It is the way in which energy happens on this planet. It is the metabolism of the earth, and we have demonized that as if it be the problem. And so I am totally exhausted in some ways of the narrative that happens at COP and every other climate, kind of consortium on the planet, as if we have a chemistry problem. We don't have a chemistry in the air problem. We have a break in our relationship to biology on this planet, and that's certainly evident, on the farmland, but it trickles through all of our micro to macro behaviors. And as was so poignantly put together here, it is not a coincidence that we have sex trafficking and child trafficking on the scale that we have today at the same time that we rape the earth. It is absolutely the same disease. And so I am so hopeful that the narratives at this program at COP can start to pivot, because if we continue with a story that fossil fuels and CO2 in the atmosphere are the problem, we are never going to come out of this extinction spiral. Our extinction is being caused by our human relationship philosophy to the earth, and that is our agricultural system, as it always has been. It's a terrifying reality of what we've set loose on this planet with the chemicals that you're referring to there with the endocrine disruptors. And so just to give everybody a very clear demonstration, proof, undeniable scientific proof that this is happening, simply look at the 8 billion people on the planet and the last 5 decades. In the 1970s, we developed the cutting edge of the herbicide and pesticide market, which would be the glyphosate molecule, which is now 95% of the herbicides sprayed all over the world. That single chemical we now spray at 4 billion pounds a year into the world's soils. That is a water-soluble toxin that gets into our water system. And in the United States, 85% of our air, 85% of our rainfall is contaminated with Roundup, glyphosate. And so these herbicides are now so abundant on the planet that they are inseparable from our daily experience. And those molecules are functioning as antibiotics at every level of the biologic cycle of the planet. And so they're killing bacteria, fungi, protozoa, parasites. The whole thing is collapsing beneath our feet with 4 billion pounds of an antibiotic being sprayed into our planet every year. That is an unsustainable relationship to Earth. We are undermining the very foundation of all of life on Earth. By 1976, this becomes like broad spectrum herbicide. By 1982, 5 years, we have the obesity epidemic. The obesity epidemic, it was the first symptom of the collapse of metabolism of humans, because the thing that makes our energy possible are the little mitochondria, which are bacteria that live inside of our cells that happen to be super sensitive to antibiotics and other chemicals that we put in, microplastics and all these other endocrine disruptors. And so we started to undermine our relationship to the soil, which are the bacteria, inside our cells by the 1980s. Fast forward to 1992, when we started spraying our crops directly with it, not just weeds, we started spraying wheat, and then soybeans and other legumes, the chickpeas, the lentils, all of the legumes that have to be dry and all the grains that have to be dry. We started spraying in 1991, 1992 as a desiccant to speed the drying process of those crops before harvest. And within 12 months of that, we had to create a new disease called celiac disease and this gluten sensitivity movement because we were spraying the wheat with a chemical that disrupted our immune system. And so we unleashed an amazing decade of autoimmune disease that continues to climb today. Fast forward one more decade, by 2002, we realized we are demolishing the neurologic function of humans, our children with attention deficit disorder, autism spectrum disorders, and our adults with an explosion of multiple sclerosis, ALS, Alzheimer's in our women, Parkinson's in our males. All of that starts going just vertical by 2002. Fast forward another decade, you have the complete collapse of our cellular relationship to one another. That's called cancer. Cancer epidemics through all ages. We now have a city built in Houston called Texas Children's Hospital, 6 skyscrapers to house our children with cancer. The speed at which all of this has collapsed was unfathomable in 1992. We just could not have pictured disease happening at the scale that it's happening. In the United States, we are now spending $4 trillion a year managing our diseases. It is 5 times larger than our entire military and homeland defense budget. 5 times larger than the military. The military was always the biggest industry for any industrial colonial power. 5 times larger is the pharmaceutical industry. It is the largest business that's ever been created in the history of mankind, is small chemicals to treat the diseases being caused by small chemicals that's treating our food. It is a multi-trillion dollar industry on the planet. Through all the governments, you're looking at least $9 trillion a year in agriculture, with another $9 to $10 trillion a year just in the industrial countries on healthcare from treating the diseases that come from that. So you're looking at somewhere around $20 trillion a year to the chemical industry that's destroying our planet. And so we have this massive building over here that I just had to walk by again, and it just drives me nuts, called the energy transition. And I have an energy company. I'm all about it. I'm passionate about circular energy systems. I think carbon is the future of energy. There's so many exciting things about it. But the fact that there is not a building that size dedicated to soil is just a complete miss. It is a complete distraction from the crisis that we have at hand. And so we absolutely have to come to terms as fast as possible, because the next thing that happens after cancer in that 10-fold process of disease and drop in metabolism is the disappearance of gender and fertility. The third generation that comes into the uterus, poisoned by all these chemicals, does not form gender in the deep nuclei within the brain, and does not differentiate testosterone and estrogen axis as a gender in that. My grandson, who's 16, his whole generation, his whole high school, has no concept of a heterosexual identity. They think it's ridiculous to identify as male or female. This is in a small town in the middle of America that is not some coastal social left. This is deep south energy, and there is no sense of gender there, because we have destroyed the process in utero of differentiation of gender. And with that goes fertility. 1 in 3 males in the United States is infertile by sperm count now. And that trend has followed in every other Western country around the world. And I was just in India, and on the back of 80% of the tuk-tuks running around there with their little rickshaws is a 1-800 number for IVF, in vitro fertilization. Our society will not produce children in 2 more generations. We are going extinct for the disappearance of our capacity to be male, female, and reproduce. That's what extinction looks like. I'm so frustrated that we keep turning this into some sort of debate around social pressures and philosophy of sexual identity. Our children have been poisoned for generations, and the result is we are not expressing a humanity that wants to continue. If we do not come to terms with this, we will go extinct. And that's okay. I honestly, as a hospice doctor, think it's okay if we go. But we must do it awake. We must love each other into that disappearance. Because if we continue to kill and slaughter our children in the name of religion or in the name of, colonial pressure, whatever it is, we will not add to this cosmic experience of life. We will not leave behind a legacy that is worth contributing to this genomic relationship with the universe. And so we must together wake up and come to terms with the fact that we have unleashed an amazing chemical trauma on this planet, and our children and grandchildren are expressing it in front of us, and we keep missing the point. We keep externalizing it as if it's somebody else's problem, somebody else's fault. Sorry, I got a bit of a tear there,
I
but
think
your experience, I want you to talk about your endocrine disruptor experience, because you're right in it with your studies.
Yeah, thank you for that. So let me get into some of the endocrine disrupting stuff, and I'm glad that you mentioned obesity, because my master's capstone was actually on indigenous exposure to environmental obesogens. So there are a lot of chemicals that can contribute to obesity through various ways. That can be through metabolism being slowed, that can be through being more susceptible to insulin resistance, and then some of the really scary ones that were initially discovered in around 2007. This is actually a pretty young field. It can barely drive at this point. It's only 16 years old. So that was initially started in UC Irvine. There's some really well-renowned papers by Jane and Blumberg, who I would love to meet at some point in one day. But they were looking at tributyltin, which is one of the organotins that I mentioned before, and its effect on mice. So one of the really terrifying things is it caused adipose tissue growth in the liver at the expense of bone, up to 23%. So when we talk about chemical mechanisms that can cause obesity, it's the specific ways that adipose tissue is being created that are exceptionally harmful. So, there's a difference between visceral and subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat doesn't have as much of an issue on your internal organs or anything like that. That's a little bit more of an aesthetic thing. But the visceral fat, and especially fat growing in your liver when you need liver cells or bone, is a huge issue because your body is just not developing in a healthy or sustainable way. There's also been similar issues found with gestational diabetes and the ability to burn fat as a fuel source and have fat oxidation. So this is something that's been looked into in Native and Latinx mothers, that if you have gestational diabetes, your children may be less likely to burn fat before they burn muscle for fuel. So it's something that can't just be changed necessarily with diet and exercise. There definitely has to be more interventions on that. But it's also something that is frequently not believed. We tend to see overweight and obesity as exclusively a moral failing and not a symptom of our larger food system failing and colonialism failing. I'm not even getting into, well, I am going to get into it, F this, maternal health and the fact that Native women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth, even controlling for socioeconomic status, because we're not believed as much. We're not believed with our issues. We don't receive the same standard of care. It's just not seen as anywhere near as big a deal. It's seen as some kind of a personal failing, and that is contributing to our issues. And while I agree with a lot of what you said, I want to push back slightly on some of the gender stuff, because there have always been gender diverse and two-spirit people within indigenous cultures, and that it's something that is especially at risk in instances of maternal or paternal health, because they're not given the same level of care or same level of belief. So all these studies that are talking about, women's health and women mortality, not all of them necessarily identify as women. Many identify as two-spirit, and it's a construct that we have always had. But the chemical influences on overweight and obesity are a huge issue that really need to be addressed. I mean, there are so many ways that it messes with your endocrine system. We're talking about the fat oxidation I mentioned before. We're talking about fat growing when there should be liver cells. There's also something called diabesogens, which are make you more susceptible to developing diabetes. One of the ones just off the top of my head, PCB 153, actually works synergistically with your diet. So basically, you can have a lower threshold for how poorly you can eat before you develop health issues. And some people are able to have a few free passes here and there, and some people aren't. If you've been exposed to PCB 153, you have a much, much, much lower threshold for wiggle room. You can't necessarily have the same level of indulgence and not have the same types of consequences. However, it works synergistically because if you don't have that same kind of dietary issue, then it's not going to increase adiposity, and it's not going to end up impacting your overall metabolism as much. So sorry, I'm trying to explain that, but basically it's chemical exposure will only work synergistically in some cases with poor diet, and poor diet will work synergistically with chemical exposure, making it something that is not necessarily doomed. If you've been exposed to this, which most of us have, you're not necessarily doomed, but it is something that's important to know, so that way you can be more careful and not feel like this is your fate. Another thing, if we're going to talk about maternal health and our future generations, is obesity and disease caused by exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals affects us at an epigenetic level, and it is heritable. It quite literally methylates your DNA, and by methylate I mean it changes the physical structure. It adds on an extra, what we call a methyl group, which you can think of that you're getting dressed in the morning and all of a sudden you've added on a really garish coat that just looks awful, but you can't take it off. That's basically what it does, and it's passed down to the next generation. So our current methods of obesity prevention that focus exclusively on an individualistic and a moral failing method are not addressing the issues that are going to get passed down to the next generation. This isn't going to be solved with a farmer's market. These methods are not making sure that the next generation doesn't have these heritable diseases. So if we want to combat diabetes and other forms of chronic disease, we have to combat exposure to obesogens and other endocrine disrupting chemicals.
Thank you so much. I think also in the interest of time, I will try to wrap up here and then open for some questions. And when wrapping up, I think I would firstly like to thank you both so much for your, I think, very brave, hardcore intellectual realism. I think that's what we really needed at that point, and I think if I might be allowed, without relativizing this realism in any sense, use a phrase that I also learned from some indigenous people, which is at this point, it's absolutely okay to be an intellectual pessimist, but we still got to stay optimists of heart. And I would give a little story just so we can end out of this with optimism, because I think since our planet in the last 3.8 billion years developed only in the last 500 million years a biosphere conducive to life, we had an Earth system breakdown already 5 times. And life always regenerated more complex, more cooperatively than before. And just as you said also, we had amazing life on this planet with much, much higher CO2 concentrations than now. The difference was that life and ecosystems were much more vital. So for example, when the dinosaurs died. Oh, they didn't die then, but our greatest mass extinction event that we know, 266 million years ago before Christ. And of course, the great difference still is that those extinction events played out on a much, much bigger time scale, quite unimaginable for humans today. But we also had a full breakdown of the plant, animal, bacteria, fungi cycles. So photosynthesis capacity broke down, plants and animal ocean life almost completely died off, but we came back as life on Earth because we always had a fungi spike after those mass extinction events. And I think we can envision also, as you both are bringing it so beautifully together, that it's not only psychologically, not only biologically or biogeochemically, but that the fungi, we can envision a re-inoculation of our society with fungi both in biogeochemical terms, but also in social terms. So what do fungi do? They decompose and recompose in cooperation. We can have social fungi that decompose the hate that is growing and maybe us today ever deeper from a geopolitical winter, even in a nuclear winter, which might be even faster than our own self-extinction by chemicals. Mm-hmm. And then we have a recomposition of life inspired by indigenous people around the world into an ancient future, which is bringing hope, cooperation, and love back to the heart of our relationship with each other and with the land. And therewith I would give 2 questions, as we promised that before. Please, if anyone has some questions.
Thank you for an extraordinary panel and building on an extraordinary talk yesterday. I don't know whether we should hope for systemic collapse in order to regenerate, but in this interim phase, the individual feels very small. How can what food choices can individuals make to gain nutrition sort of today, even those with money? How do we make it affordable for those that don't? And how do we, with our choices, protest what's happening? How do we, particularly in cities, eat?
Do you want to answer?
Sure, yeah. I can take a gander at this. It's obviously an extremely complicated topic that is going to vary a lot place by place, city by city. One of the things I think to remember is that buying organic, exclusively organic, is not going to be the sole savior for it, especially because our lands have been so poisoned. It actually takes 3 years of farming on a piece of land without using pesticides before it can gain organic status, at least in the US. One thing that does work and that I will advocate for is a more plant-based diet, sticking away from animal agriculture. I mean, plant agriculture obviously has a lot of violence within it as well in our current systems, but animal agriculture is like exceptionally bad and also is a way to expose yourself to a lot more chemicals and hormones that will bioaccumulate in animal tissue. A lot of the endocrine receptors we're talking about bioaccumulate in fatty tissue. So it sticks within us, and then it also sticks within animals and animal products like milk or other dairy products that you're then ingesting. So even just on that level, it's a little bit safer to try and avoid things like that. Yeah, I guess another thing that I want to stress is it's not just what we eat, it's how and why we eat. I think that one of the biggest casualties of our current food system is having a healthy relationship with food and a healthy relationship with eating. So trying to really think about that from a very deep kind of perspective is something I would also advise. It was really interesting. I had the honor of speaking a couple of months ago with Queen Quet, the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, which is an Afro-Indigenous nation from Jacksonville, South Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida. And she mentioned that in their culture, when they sit down to have a meal, it's quiet because they are enjoying and respecting their meal and the effort that it took to make this food and how it is going to nourish their bodies, and essentially eating food in a more intentional way and without guilt. I was like, wow, eating without guilt, that's revolutionary. Sad to say. But that's just one of the things that I've thought about. And I think that that also has an impact on the way we end up treating ourselves, treating each other, and the choices that we make when we're eating food in a way that is more intentional and with some reverence for it.
Maybe you want to add to this?
That was beautiful. I totally agree with that. I think the most radical, revolution that we can do as an individual, which is enough to change the earth. Like you mentioned, how small we can feel as individuals. The universe is created by every single individual. I really have strong beliefs that we are each manifesting this world, and it's not Monsanto or Bayer or any pharmaceutical company. I am manifesting the world I live in by participating in the witness of it and not changing my behavior. And so what is that radical change that I have to make in my life to not be continue to manifest the reality I live in? And I think ultimately what gets back to the very first question we started to answer is, what's the difference between communicable disease and colonialism? It's the same thing. We have to get back to being able to receive from Earth instead of taking from her. We need to be able to be in a relationship where we understand the power of co-creation and the gifting economy of natural systems. If we are giving our art and creativity, and most of all our capacity to see the beauty of nature back to her, she will provide with such abundance for us. We've now done this with EKGs on plants and everything else. House plant taken care of by an individual will suddenly change its metabolism, perk up, up-level its energy field when that individual comes within a 2-kilometer area of the house. If it knows its caretaker, who knows and loves it and sees the beauty in it, is coming home, it up-levels its energy. If we start to come home again, all of the plants of the earth are going to up-level. We don't know that we're home. We have forgotten that we are all, each of us, indigenous to this planet. Colonialism isn't a phenomenon of peoples. It's a phenomenon of philosophy. We are all indigenous. Every single person here. Actually, if you're listening to U.S. Senate now, there might be some visitors from other planets and things like that, but the vast majority of us are from this earth. We are of these elements within the soil of this planet. We are built by the microbial intelligence. We think by way of the microbial intelligence within us. And so we are of earth, and as soon as we recognize that and come into this new relationship to realize that we are home, and that tree behind me starts to feel this audience being like, oh my gosh, this is my planet, this is home, this is what I call home, and I can see the beauty in it. Everything will up-level. Everything will up-level. And it can't be underestimated because it's the only path out right now. There is so much epigenetic and genetic trauma from the last 50 years of chemicals in our food system. It will continue to compound. If we completely stop all herbicides and pesticides today, it will take us 5 to 10 generations to change that genetically, at which point we will be extinct. It is impossible for us to, in any kind of traditional linear healing process, solve for the nuclear bomb that we have set off in our genetics through chemical agriculture. It is impossible to survive that level of trauma because each generation compounds the trauma. It expresses it more severely with each generation. In the 4th generation from our first glyphosate spraying, we will start to understand the full impact of that glyphosate spraying. We don't know what that 4th generation looks like yet. Generation is 25 years. So that those born in 2050 will start to show what the Green Revolution really did to the human genome. We will see how bad disease really gets. by 2035, 1 in 3 children in the United States will have autism. And so we will not know until 2050 just how bad we have done. And in that 4th generation, the trauma is no longer epigenetic, but it goes to what we call a germline mutation, where it is now the genetics of every sperm and ovum on the planet. That's the 4th generation after chemical trauma. And so not only does it continue to compound and reveal itself, it then gets stored for the permanent genetic record in the 4th generation. And so we have 1 or 2 more generations left that we could change the epigenetic trauma so that it doesn't go germline. That's our only way out of extinction. And I believe the only way that we can make that big of a radical change in our epigenetic expression of the last 50 years of chemical trauma is to radically uplevel the frequency of resonance of a human being. To do that, we have to lose fear, guilt, and shame, which is such a radical impossibility in any rational sense of the mind. But if any of you have gotten to dive into this world of mindfulness, meditation, silence, breath work, cold plunging, get into the ocean in the morning cold, elemental, feel what it feels like to be at the edge of biology, push your body through breath, push your body through silence, push your body to listen, and you will up-level your energy field so dramatically that you will erase trauma at the genetic level. It cannot be done by distance from the trauma. It only gets worse. If you keep expressing that epigenetic trauma, it will get worse every generation. So your only option is to erase the trauma now. And the only way I have found to do that in my clinic and everything else is to go into our deepest practices that have been part of our indigenous wisdom in every peoples on this planet, which is to be silent, to fast, to breathe, to move, to give gratitude, and ultimately the most extraordinary study that just was done, they were trying to prove that love and joy were the highest frequency states that a human being can be in. So they put humans in Faraday cages, which was an electromagnetic field shield, and measured the frequency of resonance of that being. When they told stories of love and joy, these beings elevated to this frequency that was so beautiful. But once in a while, they were seeing these people up-level by 40 to 400 times higher vibration than love and joy. And it turned out the thing that was triggering that was authenticity. Moments of authentic being is 400 times higher than the experience of love. Your most powerful way to erase all trauma, and express the new humanity is to be authentically you. And right now, that means for a lot of us that we don't identify with our gender. And that means that for a lot of us that find ourselves neuroatypical, it's currently called, we cannot be programmed with the old philosophies or beliefs or metrics of value systems. We cannot, as autistic peoples, believe any of the other bullshit, because as you become autistic, you are losing your ability to filter reality. It's called sensory reprocessing defect in medicine, but all it really is a failure of your ability to fake yourself out. An autistic child suffers because they can see the reality that has been handed to them. They can't filter that out. They can't believe that the reality being told to them on TikTok is real. They can feel reality because they can't put the egoic shield in front of it. So we need autism. We need gender dissolution. We need all of these things that are happening here are necessary for us to overcome the 4,000 generations of colonialism at that human belief system level, because it is the oldest womb in human history that we are separate from nature, that we got kicked out of the garden. And so this is what we need to come to in our silence, is the most authentic state that we have ever shown up as in humans. To realize we are the amalgamation, we are the co-creation of all of biology within the soils of this earth, and it is speaking through us. Nature is speaking through each of you, and you picked this generation to show up. There's 8 billion of you out there. 8 billion. 8 billion souls showed up right now to be part of this revolution at the moment of our dissolution. And so we must begin to witness rather than extract. We must begin the real revolution, which is silence, breathing, the witness of the world we live in, the witness of ourselves ultimately, and then we will become creators instead of consumers. For too long, you have been metriced as a consumer. Stop consuming and become a producer. If you can't think of what to produce, sit down with a pen and a paper and let it start to flow out of you. Maybe it's a poem. Maybe it's a whole list of your heartbreaks, your grief, your joys, your loves, your interests. But start to create on that piece of paper, and maybe you will suddenly draw something or create something. And in your art, you will find your humanity again. In your art, you will stop doing damage to this planet. And nature is going to speak through us so beautifully. And I believe we can create a new humanity. I believe we can absolutely create a new genomic history and a new genomic future for the children, grandchildren, and the rest that will come after us. But we must start in silence, together, in gratitude, love, joy for sure, but ultimately authenticity. Because you guys showed up on purpose. There is no doubt that you're supposed to be here. There's no doubt that you are given everything you need in this moment to be part of this end of an epoch and the beginning of the next. We must stop the behaviors now. We only have a couple years left to see the beauty in one another. It is so intense to sit at the deathbed of a patient. As a hospice doctor, I got to do that 80 patients a week being admitted to my service to die. When you witness death and you really feel it, life becomes worth living, and you stop fearing death. And when you stop fearing the death, you start to live so much more authentically.
Thank you, Jack. I think that's a wonderful finish. I think on that, I don't need another word to say. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, bro.
Appreciate you.
you guys are going to get mic'd up now. Anger? Right. Yeah? Are you both ready? Ready? Yeah? Oh, wait. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for staying with us and joining us back for our second panel of the day. This is curated by Youth for Ecocide Law, and they're going to be discussing how we can end ecocide and raise hope. Please join me in giving them a massive round of applause as we welcome them onto the stage. Thank you.
Maybe I have to. Oh. to the other things. I don't know where my notes are. Sorry. Qué pena, no.
Are we? All right. Thank you for joining us and being here to listen to our panel. It's on End Ecocide and Raise Hope. Of course, we know with all the happenings of climate change and the climate crisis, there's a lot of anxiety going around and a lot of language that deals with doom. But today, we complete COP, in the next few days, we're trying to look on the other side of the gloom and try to bring a bit of hope to the young generations, the future generations. Of course, with the audience online as well, other generations are too invited to join into our hope. And I will start by defining what hope is to some extent. Then we can have a footing on what the conversation will take in terms of direction. So, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, hope is defined as to expect with confidence and to desire with expectation of obtainment or fulfillment. Another definition from the Cambridge Dictionary, to want something to happen or to be true, and usually have a good reason to think that it might happen. So, of course, with the groundings of ecocide law and what we're campaigning on how we want it to be declared and as well pursued as an international crime. So my favorite definition of hope amongst all of those is to want something to happen or to be true, and usually to have a good reason to think that it might happen. So now with me on stage, I will proceed to introduce the panelists who will be helping drive this conversation. Starting from my far right, we have Aditi. Shetty, and she's an environmental lawyer from Mumbai, India, and works as a legal advocacy or academic task force of coordinator for World Youth for Climate Justice. She's also a researcher at the British Institute of International on Comparative Law. Her research focuses on climate change, law, and international environmental law. Before entering the environmental law sphere, Aditi practiced criminal and civil litigation at Mumbai High Court in Mumbai. A round of applause for Aditi. Right. Thank you. And next to Aditi is Maite. I will read her introduction. Maite is director of Stop Ecocide campaign in Spanish. She has a degree in law, and then she is a writer, author of Rainbow Warriors, Legendary Stories of Greenpeace Ships. She's actually a sailor and a seafarer, a teacher, and is specialized in ecological ethics, sustainability, and environmental education. She has a long history of work in human rights, peace, and environment in direct collaboration with numerous organizations as a worker, volunteer, and activist. Finally, Maite has spent much of her life giving talks and lectures and developing environmental awareness projects. A round of applause for the captain. Right. Next to her is Leah, and this is her introduction. Leah is a lawyer for public international law at Client Earth. Client Earth is a legal environmental charity that uses the power of law to protect on Earth. Prior to joining Client Earth, she worked in public international law and human rights, including cases before the International Court of Justice, as the ICJ, and the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, and in search and rescue for the Mediterranean Sea. A round of applause for Leah. Of course. So next to her is Beth. Beth is a climate activist originally from Dublin, Ireland, and currently in her final year of law at the University of Cambridge. She has been involved in organizing since 2019, beginning with climate strikes, and has worked nationally and internationally on climate justice law and education. She has been involved in the case which overturned Ireland's climate legislation and coordinated a 2-year process for a special thematic report, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Children, I guess, to draw a link between children's rights and climate crisis. She's at the university, currently undertaking a final dissertation on ecocide. She's an Arctic angel and is working with Global Choices to research international law and write a proposed moratorium on industrial activity in the Arctic. A round of applause for the Arctic angel. All right, we're going to be having one panelist joining us. We'll have a video of him played towards the end. And I will read his bio. His name is Robert. Robert is a 10-year-old climate communicator and activist based in Toronto, Canada. He started a YouTube channel, Children's Climate Champion. You should follow it. And where was I? Started a YouTube channel, Children's Climate Championship, over a year ago, and where he interviews kids under the age of 12 years, as well as scientists and civil society representatives about climate change, biodiversity loss, and initiatives to help save the planet. Robert was a delegate at the Convention of Biodiversity in COP28 Montreal last year, where he was invited to give an in-person speech to decision makers. He will be joining us virtually, and I hope he is also streaming in. Last one as well is Debbie Buyaki. So I will read her bio as well. Debbie Buyaki goes by many hats, but her recent preference has been that of a tree planter, founding a project that covers 6 of the 7 continents now, going into thousands of trees and a few notable awards. She's passionate about environmental justice, and over the years has watched it grow into a passion that now deals with legislation and climate justice. She believes the war against the climate crisis needs to be fought on all possible angles and battles collectively, each role stepping up to contribute to the collective goal of averting it. By this, she recently has been involved heavily in fighting the war on the legal field, focusing on ecocide law to protect the environment against mass damage and destruction. I could go on, but that's me. I'm done. All right. Thank you for coming, and we will begin to debunk what End Ecocide and Raising Hope is about. So I will give a brief rundown of the program, especially to our panelists. We will have 45 to 50 minutes panel discussion and 10 minutes, hopefully, for Q&A. And that being said, I think I've covered most of the nitty-gritties, and we'll begin now from my left going that side. So I will ask you quite a large and long question that is in 3 parts almost. What is your story about severe environmental destruction that is important or close to you, especially from back at home where you come from? And the other follow-up question is this what made you join climate justice activism? And what actions so far have you taken to curb these injustices? So what made you get there? Is this the reason that you got there? And what are the actions as well you've taken to continue with the reason you started, Beth?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of a story of environmental destruction that's important to me, I suppose for me, and I'm not contractually obligated to say this as an Arctic Angel, but it is the Arctic. And it's because it wasn't the reason I first got involved. I first got involved in 2018. I had just turned 15. And the IPCC report came out, and I think I had been. So I'm from Ireland, I'm from by the sea in Ireland, and I had been in a very privileged position where up until that point I hadn't seen the impacts of the climate crisis. Like, there's the odd flood, there's the odd storm in Ireland, and it's increasing, but we're very much a global north country who's not seeing the impacts yet and is in fact contributing to it. And I think reading that report when I was 15 was what made it become very real for me. And then that's when I started getting involved in the strikes. So the Arctic wasn't the initial reason I got involved, but it's something I'm very heavily involved in now, because it was only after a couple of years of climate work when I realized how intrinsically connected the Arctic is to absolutely everything. I think up until that point it had been something quite far away. You know, I'm from Ireland, why would I care about the Arctic, which is so far from me and is kind of something that just, you know, the countries in the Arctic regulate. But actually it's essentially the air conditioning of the world. The Arctic keeps us cool, and as the ice melts, because we know the Arctic is melting 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world, that is putting all of us in jeopardy. That is upsetting our water streams, that is upsetting our entire global ecosystem. It's causing biodiversity loss as animals move. And essentially, once we lose the Arctic, we can't get it back. Because as Global Choices, the organization I work for, always says, we can't plant ice. Once the ice is gone, it is gone, and it is incredibly delicate. And so we're losing this ice at unprecedented rates. We might see ice-free summers in the Arctic by 2030. And right now, while all of this is happening, to me the logical response seems to be, well, let's stop emissions, let's stop it melting. But some countries and companies who maybe they know something I don't know, are seeing this as an economic opportunity. And so essentially what we're saying is this is environmental destruction happening in front of our eyes. It affects every single person, no matter where you are from. And that's why we need to tackle it and make sure that the long-term sustainability of that region is put ahead of the short-term economic gain. So I guess that's me.
So is this what made you join it? You say, yes, it is. And the other follow-up question was, what actions so far have you taken to continue with this fight for saving the Arctic?
Yeah, so in terms of actions since then, so the Arctic Angels, for anyone who doesn't know, is a network. Right now we have 67 young women from around the world working to protect the Arctic. I think we represent over 30 countries. And our key proposal is a moratorium, or a pause. So essentially it's a 10-year pause on industrial activity in the central Arctic Ocean, which is the area that doesn't belong to any one country. It's a global commons. It belongs to all of us as humanity. And so we're saying for 10 years, no oil and gas drilling, no deep sea mining, no transpolar shipping, no seismic testing. Just leave the area alone, let the ice heal, and use that time as well to cut our emissions, to begin phasing out fossil fuels, and to protect this region. And essentially, like I said, instead of seeing the melting ice as an economic opportunity, see it as a signal of the threat that we are all facing, and which will continue to spread around the world, and which we're already seeing today.
All right. I actually found out that with every, you correct me if I'm wrong, with every increase in centimeter of the sea level, 2.3 million people are affected, and we're not talking about centimeters anymore. We're talking about meters going forward. So I think the Arctic is something many people in climate don't talk about, but it's quite a domino effect maybe when you talk about it. So going to Leah, what is your story and why did you start?
So I started because I used to work a lot with refugee and migrant populations specifically, or predominantly coming from the sub-Saharan, from the area of sub-Saharan Africa to the European Union. And speaking to people on sort of the reasons that they had for leaving or for going on that journey. And by that journey, I mean across the Mediterranean Sea. I don't mean sort of regulated pathways. A lot of the time people would start talking about the conditions back at home relating to less water available to, go about their agricultural activities, which meant less job opportunities or conflict over resources. And a lot of the time that wasn't specifically linked in the conversations that we had to the environmental changes and climate change. And so that really was what got me involved in climate justice, because I felt that that connection isn't, or at least at the time wasn't made often enough, and wasn't really present and put at the center of some of these conversations that we were then having about these movements of people and sort of the way that, or their reasons for leaving and their reasons for having to leave. And so that's why I decided to become involved in environmental law, and I now work for an environmental law charity. To get to your next question of how I've put that into action, I now work for an environmental law charity. I'm in our human rights team, and we have, over the past couple of years, been able to support the Torres Strait Islanders, a group of 8 indigenous people from the Torres Straits in their claim before the UN Human Rights Committee. I'm also leading our case. We currently have a case supporting a group of claimants in Germany in a case on the Constitutional Court for a right to clean air. And I've also had the honor of working with Aditi and her colleagues, the World Youth for Climate Justice, without wanting to say too much about their work, but a great global campaign for climate justice. And so that's really how I've put some of that sort of passion and concern into concrete action.
All right, I think justice is really a key thing to you, and you've worked various ways to try make justice come up in environmental space, I guess. So to Maite, what has been your story and how have you channeled that into action?
Well, I think that my story started when I was a child, and there was a guy in Spain that made TV programs about the beautiful nature and animals that we have in Spain. So I started like loving the nature I had it around in my country. But then I was 11 and I saw an images on TV that made changed my life. That was the people of the first Rainbow Warrior trying to protect the whales. And then I said, to myself, one day I'm going to be with these peoples. And then time went by and I got involved with human rights. I think that it all comes together. When we are talking about the protection of Mother Earth, we are also talking about the protection of all the living beings in Mother Earth, including humans. So they are linked together. And then I had 4 years like working with human rights, and then also being with Greenpeace. And there was a point that life took me to be on Greenpeace ships. And the thing is that for many years I was reading these terrible, so sad reports of what was going on in the planet. So, all of them were catastrophes. And then you see people trying to stop this. But then I started sailing, and that's when I met hope, because I sailed all over, and wherever we went to, we met people who were fighting to, defending the forest, defending the river, the beach, their own city, because there was a project to build a nuclear power station or a central power station and things like that. And then I realized that we are many people in the planet protecting the planet that we think we are. So now what we have to do is to be connected. And there is also something that happened is that, I've been an activist all my life in human rights and doing actions, at the front line with Greenpeace. And it was like, I had a feeling that we were winning. This is like a battle. This is a war against life in the planets, and there is a war. It's not it hasn't been declared openly, but we have that. And then in this, we are winning some battles. For instance, we got the moratorium to protect the whales, yeah? And we have agreements in the worst toxic products that we have produced, like the COPs and things like that. But in the end, it's like the feeling that we are losing the war. And then I came to meet Polly Higgins, the Scottish lawyer who started Stop Ecocide. And listening to her, I understood that there is something that is really missing in this scenario of defending the earth, and that is law. And because, I always felt that I belong to a planet. I have been born in a place, I live in another place, I've been moving all around, but the thing is that we are all living beings sharing the same home that is a tiny dot in the universe. So this is our common home. And there is something that it is lacking in the protection of this, our home, that is international law. And that's something that it was like, yes, that's why, even if we are working very hard to defend the planets, we need the law to come with us. So that's why I understood that really to make ecocide an international crime that will help all the campaigns in the protection of human rights and also in the protection of nature rights. It puts together everything, because when an ecocide takes place, then it affects everything, all lives, including humans. You talk about the indigenous peoples. Imagine, like you are living by a river and you are living in a harmony with the territory you live in, but then where the river, up there in the river, an illegal mining company starts a mine, and then it pollutes your water. So it affects not only the fish or the life that is in the river, it affects all the life that depends on that river. And it affects also your human rights, because so often people has to live where they live because they cannot live there anymore because of ecocide. So yeah, and that's also puts hope, because it's like having, hope is something that we have in the horizon and marks the place where we have to move on and to go to. And we have to go all together with having all the tools that we need for this transformation.
All right, all right. I think that's a beauty with hope and courage to some extent. It is infectious. So the fact that you saw many people are fighting on the same side as you was something that gave you hope. That's beautiful to know, and I hope we also get the same infection today with the end of this panel. I'll move to Aditi.
Thank you so much. I think I'll begin with my personal story. And I didn't realize it was climate change or global warming at that point. I am from India. I used to trek in the Himalayas. I say I used to because I don't live in India anymore, and I dearly miss that. But I used to trek in the Himalayas. I started trekking in the Himalayas when I was in school. My dad was the one who introduced me to it with a couple of friends. And when I was in school, we used to go during the Himalayan summers. So our summit points, like the last climb, they used to be in the snow because of the altitude. And it was hard, it was fun, but after the end of it, while we were coming down from the summit on the same day, because it was snows, we had our ponchos, so we used to not walk down anymore. We used to lay down our ponchos, sit on it, and then slide down on the snow. And it was great fun, and we loved it, and that went on. And then the last time I trekked, I think, was in 2019. And again, it was a high altitude trek. I was in the Sikkim region of India, which borders Nepal, and we barely had any snow. It is a very high altitude trek. People, when you're walking up, you realize the altitude because you start feeling dizzy if you're not hydrated properly, if you're not acclimatized properly. So these are snow-capped regions. They're supposed to be snow-capped regions. And we didn't do that anymore. And then the year before that, we couldn't slide down anymore. And I was like, okay, maybe not enough snowfall, maybe not enough snowfall. And that was like a general, you know, topic of conversation that we used to have with the guides over there, with the people over there. And then from there, I was like, and then, you know, obviously I was in school, I was reading, and then I was like, and then I came across this article topic and just conversations that we used to have about how the Himalayas is the third pole. So when you're talking about the Arctic, the north and the south, the Antarctic, and then the third pole, which the Himalayas has perhaps not as much permafrost as the two poles have, but it's supposed to be that kind of a zone. And it is not anymore, it's declining. And from there, my interest began. I was like, I don't know if I can do anything about this. I don't know what to do about this. So yeah, I was just studying at that point. And then when I finished my law, one of my law semesters had environmental law as a subject, and I studied it. I learned a lot about Indian legislation, fundamental constitutional changes that we've had since 1947, 1950, and how it protected the environment and what was necessary to protect the environment was basically through court cases, legislative amendments, and through that sort of a story, it all changed, and that was my reason of like getting into the field of law in the first place, and then trying to find out how I can work on this sphere. And I don't want to say it's unfortunate, but for many factors and reasons, practicing environmental law is not as prevalent as it is in many other countries. So I started my practice in civil and criminal litigation, because criminal litigation was something that I thought that was impacting human rights and people around me. While I was studying, I was like, okay, how do I get around this? How do I get into this field? And I did my first master, and that was again I studied the Chipko movement, which is where the women surrounded the trees and protected them against corporations who were cutting them down and cutting down the forests, which were basically their home, their livelihood, and the source of income, their culture, everything, their heritage. And I was like, okay, I need to go further into this. So then I studied my master's, my LLM in international environmental law. And to come to your now question about how I got into this space was during my LLM in the UK, I met a few people, which is now World Youth for Climate Justice. And we were a bunch of university students back then. And we were like, okay, we're gonna take climate change and human rights to the highest court possible, because we know litigation has worked, not just in my country, but a lot of countries, and we are studying those cases right now. But how do we do that? And then we met a few people from the Pacific who were the ones who pioneered this, and we were like, okay, let's do this, we're gonna do this. We banded together as a global movement. We were supported, it was picked up by the government of Vanuatu, and they decided to champion it at the United Nations General Assembly, which was then passed into a resolution by a consensus vote earlier this year on 29th of March 2023, and now it is pending before the International Court of Justice. So that came into the law, and that's where it all came together. And obviously we're very lucky to have that kind of support. We've had support from Planet Earth, we've had support from Stop Ecocide Law, we've had support from so many other organizations, and it has been phenomenal, and that's how my journey into the space will still hopefully take me further.
All right, I think I'm going to add to hope being infectious to now hope being courageous as well. And we also, a round of applause for Vanuatu, because they're our biggest friends at Stop Ecocide as well. So Thank you for being daring students, dreaming to take it to the highest score. That's a beautiful dream. Tell you what, I am those moderators who keeps nodding and listening, and then time goes. But I'm gonna be strict with my next question. I will ask them to cut your mic. I'm joking. So, short on time, with the anonymity of the tasks everywhere. You work with ICE. You work. In the legal side, you work in the human rights side. The task is so huge to stop the climate crisis. And we're all fighting it individualistically or holistically through different organizations and paths. What my question is, and there's a few other questions that maybe I hope we'll get time to answer, but what gives you hope in facing this huge task before, the so-called ticking bomb of 2030? What gives you hope, shortly?
I'll be short. I suppose in one word, it's community. And I think to expand on that, I think when you look at the scale of the climate crisis, right, it's huge. And there's so many different parts to it. And sometimes I find myself, even in the run up to COP, thinking, okay, well, how can I even process, food systems, the Arctic, law, energy transition, all these different issues that come together. And the simple truth is no one person can be working in all of those areas, or if you are that one person, I'd like to talk to you, because it's huge. And so I think having a community where people can come together and where you know that if you need to take a step back for a bit of time, or if you need to focus on something specific, there's a collective that are all working towards that similar goal of a just transition and of climate justice in their own ways and in their own fields that are important to them. And I think the most empowered and the most hopeful I have felt is when I'm surrounded by other people working towards that same goal, and that's why I think it's so important.
Of course. Leah, what gives you hope?
I would agree. I would also add, I think what you just said, we all have different approaches to climate action, to, curbing the climate crisis as good as we can. And I think it gives me hope to see that there's people choosing different approaches, different areas to focus on. But yes, at the end, with the same end goal. And I think one thing that also gives me hope is, taking it back to sort of the legal work that I do, seeing the amount of young people that are using legal tools, because I think also tying it to that, overarching issue of intergenerational justice, we're seeing younger people being excluded from the political processes that lead to decisions, but that also have led us to where we are today because of age, voting rights restrictions, but also if we look at sort of the average age in parliaments around the world and how that doesn't reflect younger people, younger generations. And I think seeing younger people using, different tools, including litigation, other legal pathways for more climate action, to have and to make their voices really heard, and to show that, hey, we're watching, but we also can fight back. And I think that's also something that's giving me hope.
Mighty?
Well, I totally agree with you too. Of course, I will add that there is something going on, and it is this shift from an anthropocentric look at the planet and our societies, and there is a shift to biocentric, and that is very, very important, because it's like to put life on the table, and to work in all from the youth, from the not so young people. Like we are coming together, we are building a network of people working from different backgrounds to make these shifts and to put the protection of life as the center of our activities. And this is so important, and we are in the way to do it. And to look at all the problems that we are facing now, climate change, the pollution, the loss of biodiversity, all this big environmental crisis that we are facing now, that we can put solutions if we all come together, and we are doing it. And we are changing, this perspective. So for me, that is the hope, that we are coming together and shifting to a biocentric action.
What gives me hope? As I mentioned earlier, I think when I was learning and studying, I came across a lot of cases, and I spoke to a lot of people, also from my native place, which is a coastal community. They talk about these changes. They spoke about how they worked, or how they, with the protests and a lot of their action, they eh, asked the government or made the government do certain things that were in their interest, that was not being looked at, or they were not being able to participate. I think that gives me hope. In terms to illustrate this, I think it was, I think I would go back to the Chipko movement, where a few people who are not as educated as I am, who don't have the access to the languages like English, which is an international language that I speak, they don't have the resources and capacity that perhaps I, I, am, I have at this stage, at this point, and still they, with whatever they had, they fought for their home, their culture, their heritage, their livelihood, everything. If those people can do it, and if I have the privilege of doing it, why am I not doing it? And if that's not happening, then I don't know. I'm not sure I'm doing the right thing. And I don't know, it's just my conscience that tells me that no, I need to do more, because if other people who don't have the resources that I have can do it, then why can't I? And as you can see, it's turned out, and it's not just for the Chipko movement, it's happened in Brazil, in Ecuador, in places where they've revived rivers that were dead. And if people with that capacity, those resources can't do it, I feel I have the moral responsibility to do it as well. And that gives me hope, because it has worked in the past.
Law has worked in the past. And I like what Maita said, that we're learning, we're shifting, and we're actually doing it. So the same follow-up on, if they could do it, we can, and we have more resources and better privileges to do it. So of course we all here have legal backgrounds, and we're going to take one tiny question in regards to that. How can legal solutions, especially the ecocide law, be used to curb the environmental injustices that all of you are trying to address? So ecocide is, in more or less simpler words, mass environmental damage committed by persons and corporations and all these guys and they have the knowledge that what they're doing could cause mass and long-term harm to the environment and ecosystems. So we're having a campaign through the International Criminal Court to have the ecocide law included as a fifth crime against humanity. So with all this legal backing, how can legal solutions like the ecocide law and like the advisory opinion in the ICJ be used to curb injustices that you're currently addressing?
Yeah, so in terms of legal solutions, law is essentially an expression of what we value and what we don't value as a society. And so I think ecocide is an expression that we value our environment, that we see it as a living thing that has rights and that deserves to be protected, and that we don't permit and that we aren't going to be complicit in companies and countries that destroy it in the sake of short-term profits. And in terms of how that links to the Arctic, I think it's absolutely crucial. I think if you're drilling for oil in the Arctic, or if you're breaking millennia-old ice apart, that's ecocide. And I think legal solutions are absolutely central to getting, firstly, the legal accountability in the sense of being able to take, say, like an oil company to court. But I think there's also a huge amount of symbolism and political accountability in it as well, as an expression of what we value as a global community, and as an expression of this isn't going to be tolerated. And I think that then links to things like getting a fossil fuel phase out in the cover text of COP28, and saying that essentially the fossil fuel industry is perhaps the biggest actor of ecocide and the biggest destroyer of our environment. And so, yeah, I think it's hugely important on a legal and a political side.
I agree. It can obviously bring accountability. It can also communicate or communicate to the wider world. There's avenues of challenging what is happening, and it's not that a political declaration, decision is the final say, but that there's still more to come, and there's tools out there to use to challenge environmental destruction. I also think, taking it back to ecocide and the advisory opinion and the other advisory opinions as well, I think it can also shift public consciousness, because I think when we're talking about the ecocide law, for example, and the processes involved and the processes that have happened to this to this point in time, we see the public discussions going on around it and people paying attention and being like, wait, what would an ecocide law look like, and what would amount to, what sort of environmental destruction would amount to ecocide, or what would a positive advisory opinion actually mean for state obligations. And so I think it also shifts public consciousness in elevating certain topics to a different level and maybe allowing people to think about think about some of these issues in different terms, but also in also hopefully putting some pressure on those actors that are behind a lot of the environmental destruction we're experiencing.
So, one of the things that criminal laws have is that they not only said what is forbidden, you know, like you cannot go beyond this red line, that it is also very important, this is very important in fact, you know, but to have ecocide and as a crime as international level, it puts the destruction of nature at the same level as the worst crimes that can be committed, and it is at the same level legally, that is very important, but also ethically. And then when you, in terms of the ethical input that a new law can bring, that's very important, as you said, you know, like it helps to change awareness, you know, like everybody awareness about how bad it is to destroy nature for everybody. That is a wrong thing to do. So for many years we have been with this saying that, well, this sentence that says, you know, who destroys pays. Yeah? And then with criminal law in place, we will have the shift to who destroys pays and also goes to prison. But then we need a third turn of these sentences, and that says who destroys, stop destroying. And that is the point. I mean, it is important to have the law to prevent things, the destruction happening, because an ecosystem, once it is destroyed, is very difficult to restore. We need to restore, of course, whatever damages has been taking place, but the important thing is just to stop the destruction.
I think I'll talk a little bit about what the AO is right now. I think Leah has stolen words from my mouth. Just to elaborate right now, the advisory opinion, the questions that are before the court talk about what are the obligations of states in terms of protecting future generations, in terms of connecting human rights and climate change, and in terms of obligations to adapt and mitigate the adverse effects of climate change, and what do these states need to do. So having clarified that in the legal sense, it paves a way and it opens, it potentially, depending on if the opinion is positive, as Leah explained, it will potentially open doors to a lot of pathways, be it ecocide or be it in the regional and domestic sphere. So if the court happens to say that no, mass environmental destruction is against Paris Agreement goals or is against, it does, like, states have to curb that, and it's, you know, within their obligations to do that, etc., etc. That'll pave a way for ecocide, perhaps, let's hopefully in the international ICC, but if that is going to take a longer term to achieve, which I know it's a massive sort of journey, but then if regional or domestic courts say that, okay, this is going to happen, it's the international court that has said it, it's the ICC that's saying this, that means that this is applicable. There is some truth and veracity to this interpretation of law. So I will look into it. As judges, we'll look into it. We'll see what the lawyers are saying, what they're explaining, and then, as she said, public consciousness will change. The process itself is already changing a lot of public consciousness, awareness, and I think that'll pave a way into ambitious legal policies, legislations, and judicial precedents that have, as I said, worked so far and hopefully will be more ambitious and work in the future because we need it.
Of course, we need it. So, seeing that we're really, really short on time, I will take one question to one panelist, and we could then speak after, because we need to also see the screening from the next generation, which I would segue after the question. Does anyone have a question to a specific person on the panel list?
Hi, thank you very much for your intervention. I'm a colleague of Maite and Debbie, and I thought your question about what gives you hope kind of touched me, because actually something also that we see more and more, and that gives me hope, is that when we approach, or when we're approached by CEOs actually, and we tell them about ecocide law, a lot of them come to us and say, I mean, a few of them have come to us and said, actually, this law could help us and empower us as CEOs. Because if this law is in place, it also means that we as individuals inside a board can go and say, hey, listen, there is a law there, and I am not going to face jail time because the board decides to put the money somewhere else. So it's also, of course, it's about deterrent. We want to deter further ecocidal activities. But there is a new thing that we are seeing more and more. It's also about empowering individuals within boards. And I think this is huge. So I'm hoping that more and more businesses are going to also get this. So I just want to share this with you. Thank you.
All right, we're going to be here after this, and we could answer many of your questions, because the topic is really wide, and what it will entail, what would that ecocide world, what would the whole UN process go to achieve this. There's a lot to debunk out of this, and we don't have time. But we cannot as well talk about ecocide law and what we hope for the future if we don't have the future with us. So I know with COP28 it has been quite difficult for children to attend, and a lot of barriers and maybe intentional or not restrictions for them. But we have an interesting young man who's really opening doors for children his age and under his age to speak about the planet they want, the hope that the life they will achieve with this crisis and how it needs to be stopped. His name is Robert, and his video has 3 other kids in it talking about how. Should I tell you or not? I won't tell you. You should watch it. So I hope we have it ready to.
Robert, and I'm from Children's Climate Championship. I'm talking to you today from Canada. I brought some friends of mine from every continent on the planet to beg you to take action. We are here to represent the 2.2 billion children on the earth today. You hold in your hands the ability to protect us, to protect your children. How you will act this month will be remembered by history. Time is running out to protect a livable future for me and my friends, and for your children. Time is running out for our planet and the 9 million species that share it with us. We only have 6 years left. This is our last chance to act before the world as we know it is gone.
Hi, I'm Ella Grace, and today I'm here on behalf of youth worldwide. We are pleading with you to set the maximum possible protections for our oceans. Without healthy oceans, we will fail to have healthy life on land, which is critical for human survival, which, above all else, is worth fighting for.
My name is Reha, and this is Danya. Together, we are the Margaret Muncher Sisters of Hong Kong and the youngest climate activists in Asia.
Our time is running out. We have less than 6 years till climate change is irreversible, and we don't want future generations to live like this, going out on the streets every Friday and talking to people about how urgent the climate crisis really is and how our world needs to be fossil fuel free.
You know, I'm starting to feel like a broken record, saying the same message over and over again and not being heard. So, leaders of this world, this is your final wake-up call to take action and be the one to be the leader of change.
We need to ban fossil fuels, as it is a root cause of climate change, and in this COP28, it needs to be cut out. There are many subsidies for fossil fuels, but in a life or death situation, we cannot cut corners and take the easier and cheaper way out, as it won't be so easy and cheap for much longer.
I want my family to be safe and happy on Earth, not having to worry about climate change and what it does to our beautiful planet. I plead every one of you to take action, as it is crucial for our Earth, and every small step makes a huge difference.
Hello, I'm Benjamin Fallon, and I live in the UK. Nature is precious and we cannot survive without it. We have to stop climate change, and biodiversity is just as important too. They're all connected. But they're losing so many species all the time. The UN report on biodiversity told us that over 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And here in the UK, the recent State of Nature report told us that a fifth of species had been lost since the 1970s. The latest report from WWF stated that the Earth's wildlife population plummeted by 70% in the last 50 years. We could be facing the largest loss of life on Earth since the dinosaurs, and it's being driven by humans. There are so many people trying to protect the planet and the millions of species that live here. Conservation work and putting laws in place to protect nature can make a real difference. We need governments to help, like legislating to ban harmful pesticides and making sure we can protect the remaining wild areas of our planet. You are the people with the power to change everything for the good of our environment. We shouldn't have to tell all these really sad facts to make a positive difference. We're here asking you to listen to the children, to fight for our planet and our future. We're not separate from nature, we're part of nature too, and we can't survive without it.
Olá, meu nome é Júlia Bonitese, tenho 11 anos e sou ativista ambiental desde os 8. Eu nasci em um país bonito por natureza, onde a música, a dança e a literatura enaltecem o mar, as florestas, a Amazônia, os rios, os povos indígenas e a alegria do povo brasileiro. Entretanto, hoje o Brasil tem medo do futuro, medo de que nossas histórias sejam apagadas pelas queimadas, pela destruição das chuvas, pela extinção da fauna, pelas secas, pela fome, pela mudança climática. E nesse momento, a minha voz sai daqui do Brasil para dizer ao mundo, em nome de todas as crianças e adultos brasileiros, que discursos bonitos não serão mais capazes de salvar nosso planeta e nos trazer esperança. Essa COP precisa mostrar que os países do mundo precisam de governantes atentos e corajosos que enfrentam com ações concretas as causas da mudança climática. A floresta amazônica tem um papel extremamente importante para a manutenção das chuvas em boa parte da América do Sul e para o combate do aquecimento global e as mudanças climáticas. Embora ela esteja localizada por aqui, é um bem mundial e precisamos unir forças para mantê-la em pé e saudável. Estou aqui hoje para implorar que essa COP traga soluções que permitam que os adultos de hoje envelheçam com a tranquilidade de que seus filhos e netos terão um mundo habitável, assim como permitir que nós, crianças, nos tornemos adultos conscientes e capazes de construir um futuro digno na natureza. Nós somos seres inteligentes e precisamos provar isso. Vamos dar um basta nas emissões de gases de efeito estufa. Vamos regenerar as florestas. Vamos permitir energias limpas e renováveis. Vamos conscientizar as crianças e jovens. Vamos ser a espécie capaz de salvar todas as outras, e não a que causa sua própria extinção.
Hello, my name is Keith, and today I'm going to be talking with you about the climate change that has affected my life and my mother's life and lots of Fijians. Most people in the rural areas of Fiji still live off of nature. They eat what they grow on the land and what they catch in the sea. They depend on the rain to water their crops and healthy coral to provide fish and seafoods. My mother, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, used to take me to the ocean to harvest sea urchins and seaweeds and all sorts of things we could eat. It is one of my sweetest memories, and I recently went to see what I could catch. Sadly, I did not catch anything. In 2016, when I was 4 years old, A huge cyclone came to Fiji when me and my mother were visiting her relatives in Iran. The wind was so strong that it tore off the roof of the house and my mother got injured. I was very scared. A few weeks before the cyclone hit, the fish even began dying in many places in Fiji because the water was so hot. People knew something was wrong. I heard in Florida just this year the water got to 38.4 degrees centigrade and all the coral had died. Climate change is killing our coral reefs and is harming our farms and homes. And the people most impacted in the South Pacific Islands are not to blame, but we are suffering the consequences. Please do your best for climate change.
My name is Holly and I'm representing Antarctica. Antarctica is changing. The sea ice is diminishing and the ice shelves are breaking. Its vast ice sheets are melting, raising sea levels all around the world. This year, sea ice is the lowest ever, leading to losses of penguins, seals and other animals that live on the continent. The sea ice is also vital for cooling our planet and driving global circulation. Its loss causes a feedback that we cannot afford to ignore. We must take action now on cutting emissions for the sake of all the future generations.
Hello, my name is Jada Nema. I'm talking to you from Kenya. Dear COP28 delegates, we need an end to all new coal, oil and natural gas projects. We need to protect the ocean, the one ocean we are all sharing, by putting an end to emission. Because the ocean is becoming more acidic due to too much carbon emitted into the atmosphere. To limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to slash emission by 45% before 2030. You are the last people who can save us. It is all in your hands. Whatever you do today will determine our future.
We need an end to the carbon capture storage fairy tale being pushed for by fossil fuel industries. We need to end oil and gas subsidies. We need to bring an end to the production of fossil fuels with targets for their phase out from this COP28. Our planet is so beautiful. It's such a gift to live here, and we still have hope that you will do the right thing. We are not doomed, but we still need to act. We can still do this. It's not too late. Don't listen to the doomerism. Listen to your kids. You are the last people who can save us. It is all in your hands. The future isn't set, and what you do today will determine our world's fate for centuries. You might have grown up wishing you were a superhero. Well, today you get to be superheroes. Don't do what's easy. Giving up is easy. Hope is hard. We need you to fight for us. Fight hard. Make us proud. Dear COP28 delegates, my name is Robert and I'm from Children's Climate Championship. I'm talking to you today from Canada. I brought some friends of mine.
All right, a round of applause for all the children. How courageous of them. I did not coordinate that. Robert did all of that. And at Stop Ecocide and Youth for Ecocide Law, we had recently launched a child's right report. And if you want to talk about that and how you could involve children going forward in fighting for climate, of course, we could speak after this. So I will let them say 5 or less words in conclusion to this panel.
I don't want to waste a word. Yeah, equitable fossil fuel phase out now and use the law to deliver change.
Strong start.
Choice.
Wow.
Good choice.
Maybe just also because today is Human Rights Day.
Yeah.
Use the power of human rights. The climate crisis is a human rights issue. And thank you all for coming, taking time out of your busy days to listen to us. You also give me hope.
So yes, never lose hope and never stop thinking in the power of every single individual person to change the world and coming together with the rest of us and to really change the situation.
I think I would say power to civil society, because whatever systemic change we've had so far, not just in the environmental or climate sphere, biodiversity sphere, but in the human rights sphere, in terms of freedom movements, in terms of slavery, abortion, in terms of equal rights, civil rights, political rights. Civil society has been in the forefront, and they've used the law, they've made the law, and then they've used the law existing to change the draconian law. So I think I'll end at that.
Okay, this is going now into the end of our discussion. I'll finish with 2 quotes and 1 short story. The first quote says, "There's some good in this world, and it's worth fighting for." And the second quote says, "Hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness." And I think the children we've just watched have reiterated that there's some good in this world. Actually, there's a lot of good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. In whichever sphere you take, we're taking the legal route. You could take a different route and still get to save our planet. So I will tell a little story about the hummingbird. It has its roots in Japan, but it was famously told by Wangari Maathai, and she's a tree planter, I'm a tree planter, so we etch a lot of our work with her. So the story starts with a big forest fire, and it was so huge that all the animals ran out to protect themselves, and they just stood and watched as it burned, except this tiny little bird that says, "I will not stand with you guys, I'll do something." So it runs to the stream, it flies to the stream and gets a drop of water with its tiny beak and comes back and drops it on the fire again. Does the same thing, does the same thing. Then the animals are just standing there, still standing there watching it, and one of them stops it. Most of them stop and say, "What are you doing? What do you think you can do? You're just a tiny bird. You have tiny wings. You have a tiny beak. It's just one drop of water." And these are animals with all the trunks that could carry liters of water at one go asking this question. But this little bird says, "I will not stand. I will do the best that I can." So I hope this also gives you the challenge that you're not too small. You can do the best that you can to stop this climate crisis in whatever field you are. This is the beauty to some extent of it, that in whatever field you are, you can actually contribute to its aversion. So thank you, ladies, today for joining on the panel. Thank you for being here. And of course, we're up for questions after this, but we have to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. So the next panel of the day is run by Emirates Nature WWF, and their and their session is entitled Notice Nature. I'm going to invite Arabella onto the stage, who's going to be hosting this session, and please give her a massive round of applause. Thank you so much.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a really exciting things to tell you about today, and actually we all